Hello, everyone. This is Admiral Jamie Foggo from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast, designed to dive deeply into policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. We aim to provide you with the highest quality analysis on the most pressing maritime security challenges by joining in conversation with experts and practitioners. Welcome to the third season of Maritime Nation. This season is produced with the support of Data Miner is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Data miner solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. While in uniform, I relied on Data Miner First Alert for situational awareness within the ever-expanding public information space. Now, today, I'm delighted to be joined by one of America's foremost strategic thinkers, the Naval War College's own Professor James R. Fitzsimonds. Jim, as his call-by name goes by, Fitzsimonds is a research professor with the Center for Naval Warfare Studies at the U.S. Naval War College, where he is the director of the Halsey Alpha Advanced Research Program. His work centers on analysis of military issues in the Asia-Pacific region, including warfighting, balances of power, and modernization trends. Professor Fitzsimonds served for 27 years in the United States Navy, both as a surface line officer and an intelligence officer. He retired in 2001 at the rank of captain. His operational assignments include USS Blakely, FF-1072, USS Enterprise, the Big E, CVN-65, and the USS America, CV-66, in the battle group, where he served as Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence in the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Storm. His shore assignments included tours with the Chief of Naval Operations Current Intelligence Division, the OPNAV Naval Warfare Directorate, OPNAV 95, the Navy Operational Intelligence Center Detachment Newport, the CNO Strategic Studies Group, and the Net Assessments Directorate of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Professor Fitzsimonds is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the National Defense University. Jim, welcome to Maritime Nation.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to share what we're doing up here at the Naval War College in terms of our advanced research projects and dealing with some of the most challenging problems we've seen over the past few decades.
Outstanding. Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation. Now, Jim, we normally begin the session of Maritime Nation with a term from the Naval Terms Dictionary. I've got my plebe issue Naval Terms Dictionary on the shelf, but I'm deviating from that tradition today, and we're going to talk about 2 Chinese naval terms instead, since we're talking about primarily the Western Pacific, the South China Sea, and China and her Navy's order of battle. So the Institute, the China Maritime Studies Institute, which is at the Naval War College, issued a report by ONI analysts Jennifer Rice and Eric Robb entitled The Origin of Near Seas Defense and Far Seas Protection. Now, I know you're going to talk a little bit about this today, so I want to put the definitions out there first. Near Seas Defense is a regional defensive concept concerned with ensuring China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests. Its primary focus is preparing to fight and win local wars within the First Island chain. Far Seas Protection has both peacetime and wartime elements. In peacetime, the Chinese Navy is expected to conduct a range of non-war military operations, such as participating in international peacekeeping, providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, evacuating Chinese citizens from danger, and engaging in joint exercises and naval diplomacy. That sounds a lot like Joe Nye's soft power. And I think the Chinese struggle to try to execute or demonstrate soft power. Now, on the other hand, Far Seas Protection also means in wartime, however, the PLA Navy could be asked to secure China's use of strategic sea lanes and striking important nodes and high-value targets in the enemy's, and folks, that would be us, in the enemy's strategic depth. Near seas defense and far seas protection is rooted in the ideas of Alfred Thayer Mahang and Mao Zedong. And Professor Jim Fitzsimonds is here to tell us about this more in detail today. So let's dive in. So Jim, you're the head of the Naval War College's Halsey Alpha Research Group, which is focused on studying how to fight a war in the Western Pacific. For those who aren't familiar, could you please explain a little bit about the Naval War College's different research groups? I know you have Halsey, which you head, the Gravely Group after Admiral Samuel Gravely, and the Ellis Group after Major Pete Ellis, who was the Marine that kind of mapped out the Pacific in World War II. So what's different about the Halsey Group and the other two? And why the Halsey Group? Why Bull Halsey? And who are your students? Who are your researchers? How's that all come together?
Sure. Happy to discuss this with you. We started the Halsey Alpha Group back in 2003, and I created what I thought would be an excellent collaborative effort between faculty and students in order to deal with what I thought were some of the most significant sea and air problems that the U.S. Navy was going to face over the coming decades. We were able to recruit 12 students back then, joint students, and we put them, essentially set them on this quest to determine what were China's goals in the Western Pacific and what types of military and maritime challenges they were going to present to the U.S. Navy over the longer term. Most of my orientation came out of one of my final military assignments, which was working as a military assistant for Andrew Marshall in the Office of Net Assessment, and really helped me to understand the challenges of major strategic competition. And there were two primary thrusts that he really held to. And one was, once you succeed in winning a major competition, and in his view, the last major competition was the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, you should expect that there will be another peer or near peer competitor waiting to take their place, and that will arise within about 2 decades. And what you have is a hiatus. And in his case, the hiatus was after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we would have about 20 years to deal with the rise of a new major competitor. And his view was it probably was going to come from China. And I think I began to accept that view, that China was going to be our major competitor in the future, although it was not at all clear in the early 90s that China had the technical wherewithal to present the type of challenge to us that we had faced in the past. Andrew Marshall's other major thrust was when you have a major period between wars, there is an accumulation of technology which can result sometimes in a military technical revolution in which most of your assumptions about how the war would be fought and what would determine the winner would prove to be erroneous. And unless you could discern these changes, these major changes in the character of warfare, you would be at an extreme disadvantage if there was subsequently a major war. And in his view, what was happening was the development of long-range precision strike, the exploitation of new technologies in which range would finally be divorced from lethality and accuracy. And you would have conventional weapons which would and could strike with extreme lethality over unlimited ranges. And this appeared to be the path that China was on. And I think China's motivation in retrospect was driven by two major events in 1991. The first was the collapse of the Soviet Union, what had been a superpower, which crumbles from within and disappears from that major level of military competition, and essentially is disaggregated against its own will. Well, I think that was China's, and continues to be China's, greatest fear, is that China will crumble from within because of these pressures, internal pressures that have to be stifled, and that foreign powers like the United States will take advantage of that crumbling. The second big event in 1981 was Operation Desert Storm, in which the U.S. defeated, in a matter of weeks, a major military power, a Soviet-equipped Iraqi military, which by some estimates should have resulted in massive casualties to the United States over a period of months and yet collapsed fairly rapidly under U.S. Attack. And I think what the Chinese discerned is that the United States was very adept at projecting power, short-range precision strike power from tactical aircraft to base close, and that what China needed to do was to fend this off. And the technical opportunities offered by these developments in long-range precision strike would allow them to do two things. One is to pursue a massive arsenal of long-range weapons to attack U.S. bases in theater and push tactical aircraft beyond their unrefueled combat radii and greatly reduce the amount of firepower that the U.S. could bring towards China. And the second one was to spend a lot of time and effort building up an integrated air defense system, which would simply deal with the leakers. So this became I think the nugget of what I decided we were going to do with the Halsey Alpha group starting in 2003, is to take about 12 joint officers and focus on this particular problem. At the time, we thought it was going to be one problem and we might go to a different country or a different problem in the future. But we were astounded over the first few years at how fast the Chinese military had adapted and built up. I mean, we're looking back 20 years now that we've been running Halsey Alpha, and it is beyond belief the extent to which they have not only built a major conventional Navy, a major conventional Air Force, but a rocket force, the PLA rocket force of such size and scope and sophistication that it has presented severe challenges to the U.S. military, unlike those we have faced since World War II. And so that was the grounding of the Halsey Alpha group. A dozen officers, 2 faculty members who decided we're going to use this group, this collaborative effort, to try and do 2 things: educate future officers on the challenges, the technical challenges of this threat, and try and come up with some actionable recommendations for U.S. decision makers as to what to do about this. So we embarked on that effort using wargaming as the backbone. We ran our first wargaming in 2004, and we've been a wargaming group ever since, wargaming only scenarios with China. And after a few years of that, we were visited by Admiral Willard, who was at that point Compact Fleet, who said, "Boy, this has given me some really good insights. I really like what you're doing. Do you have a similar group which is focused on the Middle East and Iran?" And so we immediately spun off another group, and that became the Halsey Bravo group. So that's the second of our regional advanced research programs. And then a few years ago, we spun off a third group, the Holloway group, which is the third regional group, and that's our Russia group. And all of them operate the same way. It's a wargaming-based group. We are on a trimester basis here, so we play 3 10-week games a year. We divide our students up into a red, blue, and control team, and we cycle them through red, blue, and control so they can see all aspects of the war. And we play the game at an operational tactical level. So we do China, Halsey Bravo does Iran, and Holloway does Russia. There is a fourth group, the Gravely group, which has been around since, I guess, the late 2000s, which was a technical-based group and has since morphed into a cyber group. That is more of an independent research project group with only 1 to 2 students per year, doing a deep dive, mostly in cyber-related issues. Why is Halsey Alpha called the Halsey Alpha group? Well, early on, until about 2009 or 10, we were not allowed to even hint that we were doing wargaming and analysis against China. It was considered way too provocative. So we were not allowed to call it the China group.
No kidding, really?
And our provost here at the time was a real fan of Halsey and Bull Halsey. I am not. It's the last naval officer I ever would have picked to name the group after for a variety of reasons. But he liked the name Halsey, and he said this is going to be called the Halsey Group. And so when we started a spin-off, the next group was Halsey Bravo, and the Russia group said, well, we want to divorce ourselves from the Halsey name. We're going to call it the Holloway Group instead. So that was really the genesis of these particular groups.
Hey, fantastic. I mean, there's so much there to talk about, but let me just offer a couple of comments. First of all, having the opportunity to be in net assessments with Andy Marshall must have been absolutely incredible. The first time I did a Pentagon tour was 94, 95. It was in support of the Commission on Roles and Missions of the Armed Forces, and it was a small group of us. microcosm of what you're doing that supported Admiral Borda, and our job was to really try to preserve Navy force structure. And I used to run into Mr. Marshall all the time and attend some of the briefs that Net Assessments put out for Admiral Borda's consumption, and we got a chance to sit in. Now, I remember it was around that time where Andy Marshall came up with this provocative title, the Anti-Navy Study. And Admiral Borda was a little bit taken aback. It's like, hey, could you please not call it that? So it became, what is today anti-access area denial, which we're seeing play out in Ukraine. And then, as my time in the Pentagon off and on, like 10, 12 years, I was around when General Van Riper kind of blew up Millennium Challenge because he went out and created an A2AD, which was along the lines of, Marshall's paper and his studies that kept the blue forces or the good guys from coming ashore. So your research on a different side of the world is extremely important. The fact that you're using wargaming is also very important. And I didn't know you weren't allowed to be called, weren't allowed to admit that you were studying China and had to call yourselves the Halsey Group. But, for good reason. Halsey was a tough guy. Bob Erskine used to run Flag Matters for the United States Navy. One day I was having a conversation with him when I was a very junior one-star, and I mentioned something about Halsey. And Bob looked at me and he goes, well, I knew him, because Bob had been a yeoman since World War II. And he explained just how tough he was, not on people like Bob, but on people who had responsibility and were expected to deliver. And so no doubt about that. Last thing, naval arms race. We'll probably get into it later on. I am just absolutely stunned at the speed and rapidity with which China has executed this naval arms race and expanded its influence all over the world. I was part of negotiations with the PLA Navy back in 2013 on rules of behavior in the air and maritime domain. And at the time, they may have hoodwinked us into thinking that they were looking for soft power reasons to expand, which obviously have ulterior motives, and you're going to mention some of those today. So let's move on. Along those lines, I think we're looking down the barrel of a potential military confrontation with China in the Pacific. Could be over Taiwan or the South China Sea, some of the small islands. But over the course of your long and storied career as a naval officer, now as a professor, how has our thinking on this possibility changed over the years? The fact that you weren't even able to admit that we were studying it back around 2010 or so is telling. Do we have the right outlook and perspective on this, or do you think we need to change our approach dramatically? I get it that inside the Naval War College and inside the Halsey Alpha group, people see this, they see the buildup, they see the danger, and they are concerned. How does that convey to the rest of the Joint Force, the civilian leadership, and to the American people, in your mind?
Yeah, I have to start with a disclaimer that I'm not speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the Department of the Navy. You always have to have that up front, because
Absolutely.
A lot of what we do and a lot of our findings are very controversial. I think the biggest issue is this, that China discerned early on what the real vulnerability was of U.S. power projection. And we are, as I mentioned earlier, a short-range precision strike force in which we use platforms that we move very close to the adversary to deliver large volumes of very short-range weapons with a range of less than 50 miles or so, what someone has called a JDAM conveyor belt. And China looked at this and said, I can either confront your tactical aviation in the air, but you have a stealth advantage on me. It's going to be very expensive. I'm going to pursue it, but it's going to take a long time. Or I would use long-range precision strike to attack your bases. And China was unconstrained by the INF Treaty, which the U.S. and the Soviets, the U.S. in particular, could not have ground-based systems with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers between 1987 and till about 2019. So we couldn't play in that arena. But China jumped into it with both feet. And they were using first GPS technology and then other types of advanced guidance technology to begin to achieve extreme accuracy at increasing ranges, and decided to build up a missile force again that would attack our bases. This is not new. I mean, I'll go back to Jackie Fisher, who said, "A ship's a fool to fight a fort." He attributed it to Nelson, but it was Fisher that actually said it. And what it means is that a ship is always at a disadvantage when it's going up against some type of a land-based firepower capability because of asymmetric vulnerability. The ship is shooting at the fort, has to kill every gun on the fort, but the fort only has to hit the ship and sink the ship. So traditionally, ships would stay out of range of land-based artillery, land-based missiles, and would move farther and farther back. But it really wasn't until recently that land-based systems were able to reach to virtually unlimited ranges and push ships well beyond their striking firepower, whether it be missiles or guns or aircraft. So the modern fort is not a fixed facility. The modern force is a mobile land-based missile force, the PLA rocket force, which travels around China hiding in vast expanses of broken ground terrain, which is extremely challenging to target, yet is able to target high signature ships with a great degree of fidelity. And so it goes back to this issue of, has China built an anti-navy, which people have been trying to do for centuries? And I think the answer is yes. I think they have prospectively built an anti-navy, and the U.S. Navy is now struggling to figure out, how do I nullify it? You're at an extreme technological disadvantage and extreme cost exchange disadvantage shooting interceptors at missiles. Can I kill the launchers? Well, our deficiencies in scud hunting, even when I have complete air control, have proven that's extremely challenging and probably impossible if I don't have air control. So the question is, can I deny targeting? And that's really the big fight that we're having now. Can I prevent China from seeing my naval platforms at sea, even at short ranges, let alone extreme ranges? And the jury is out on that. We're trying very hard to do it. So the Navy is in a dilemma. I think we still have a naval force and a U.S. Air Force, which are at heart short-range precision strike forces that have to get close to the adversary to unleash large volumes of ordnance. And China is shooting with great effectiveness, potentially, at those air bases, land bases and sea bases at increasing ranges, not only hundreds of miles, but thousands of miles. They are certainly building a range of weapons with capabilities, including now a massive transition to hypersonic weapons, as well as a huge volume of ordnance to make up for targeting inaccuracy, hoping to overwhelm our defenses. And the jury is out as to whether or not they can do it and whether or not we can survive this type of a missile onslaught. But if we are wrong, the Navy has to rethink its entire concept of power projection. We have to move from a platform-centric fighting force to a weapon-centric fighting force. We have to abandon short-range precision strike, and we have to embrace long-range precision strike. It's something we just don't want to do. And there's no better example of that than our own anti-ship missile inventory. The United States, in its history, has only fielded one dedicated anti-ship weapon, and that's the Harpoon. It appeared in 1977. We've never replaced it, and we have had a great deal of lack of success, I think, bureaucratically and technologically, in making this transition from the carrier-centric short-range precision strike force to the missile-centric long-range precision strike force. I don't think there's any greater question that is facing the Navy today, because it suggests a level of technological change, organizational change, bureaucratic change. If a long-range precision strike dominates, that is just almost impossible to contemplate, and yet we're going to have to make that decision.
Wow, that's some very powerful statements, sir. And first of all, as you were talking about ship versus port, it was a throwback. I was part of the Silk Road Conference many, many years ago when I worked for Admiral Jim Stavridis as the Supreme Allied Commander. We went to, as the Turks would say, Çanakkale or Gallipoli. And Nick Lambert has written about this, great British historian, concerning, Churchill's push after the Russia telegram and the question of wheat to defeat the Turks and to allow the flow of goods and services through the Bosphorus. Imagine that, over 100 years ago, we're having the same problem. And so they sent the Royal Navy in there to silence the guns in Çanakkale, and it was a third of the fleet was decimated by those guns ashore. So then the bad decision on top of the bad decision was, let's just go ashore and invade. And that didn't work out well either for the Johnnies from the Commonwealth forces. So your point is extremely well taken. I worry too about long range strike DF-21, DF-26, and of course DF-17. They already have a hypersonic. We're still in development. And the most contemplative thing that you said that we're going to have to come to grips with is, are we going to remain a platform-centric force or move into a weapons-centric force? And I'm glad that you guys are looking at this as hard as you are up at the War College and hopefully getting the right attention down here in the Pentagon. It was a century or more ago when we went from the battleship at the center of the screen, realizing that the carrier is not just a scout, it's really the crown jewel. And now we're having to come to grips with, is there another sea change coming? So thanks for what you're doing up there. Thanks for the clarity on the narrative, and thanks for putting this in perspective. These are really tough problems, and I'm glad that Halsey Alfa is looking at it. Next question for you, and we talk about the Chinese and their advantage in long-range strike. Like we said earlier, the naval armaments race is like nothing we've seen before. I mean, it may be reminiscent of the period between two wars in the 20th century, but the PLA Navy is now, I'm sorry to say, the largest Navy in the world by numbers of vessels. And I go by, I love Ron O'Rourke. He puts out some great stuff through the Congressional Research Service. He's been a friend for a long time. PLA Navy is currently at 360 ships and headed towards an end strength of estimated 430 or more by 2030. And the U.S. Navy struggles to make progress towards our statutory naval law goal of 355 ships. When you include the China Coast Guard and maritime militia forces, their order of battle expands astronomically. And we're seeing that play out in the small islands of the South China Sea now. So my question to you, Jim, is are you worried about a scenario in which China achieves naval or overmatch against the United States? We're down below 300 ships. I think we're in the 287, 290 range right now. I believe that we have better sailors, better trained officers, better equipment, and better platforms. But there is a certain quality to quantity. What do you think?
I think it is a real concern, particularly if you have a dominant long-range precision strike force that can reach out to several thousand miles. Now I can move a blue water Navy out underneath that umbrella, and really the only threat is from a submarine force operating from sanctuary undersea. And we at least we believe that the undersea sanctuary will persist and can persist over the long term, but it's extremely expensive to put weapons underwater. You're separated from your sensors. It's a sea denial force. It's not a sea control force. I think the greatest concern would be some tactical operational breakthrough in anti-submarine warfare that would really put our submarine force at untenable risk underneath this PLA rocket force umbrella. So it doesn't mean that surface ships become obsolete, but it does mean that it is the character of the warfare becomes very different. And it also would suggest that if long-range precision strike is dominant, we have to move down that path as well. We have to be able to shoot through his Clark screen and put his surface ships at equal risk that he's doing to us. And that, again, it means an ordnance-heavy Navy with long-range precision strike. There's a geographic asymmetry here, though. The dominant element of China's PLA rocket force is based inside of China. They don't face the political bureaucratic constraints of having huge numbers of mobile missile launchers roaming around the countryside and shooting ordnance, inviting retaliation. And they have the probability of nuclear sanctuary from shooting from our own homeland. We really can't match that, the PLA rocket force. We would have to build a massive land-based force that's mobile, moving around Nevada and Utah and shooting back at China. And even if that was politically acceptable, it's unaffordable, which means really our only option is to go back to sea. We have to put our long-range missile force to sea in order to provide them a symmetric matchup. But we do have to think through, what the characteristics of this are, and accept the fact it's going to be more costly for us to do it, and really make a determination whether we have to move completely underwater or whether or not surface ships will survive in this environment in the future. These are key unknowns that we need to, in the near term, make some decisions on. But China's reach also calls into question the utility and the viability of any type of blockading force for either side. Can we ever pull far enough away from his rocket force to conduct a distant blockade? And I think when you look at the development of the DF-26 and newer missiles that are going to reach even farther, I think a distant blockade becomes something that's very, very problematic. I mean, long-range precision strike and the advent of these long-range missiles, suggests a cascading effect across all levels of warfare, which we have not really embraced. And I don't even know if the Chinese have thought their way through what they're doing with these massive missile forces that can put at risk certainly high signature ships, which are at sea almost anywhere on the face of the earth. So I don't know if I got to the essence of your question. Let me put it back to you to see if I addressed what you were getting at.
No, you did. Thanks very much. And, a couple of follow-ups. I mean, in terms of the definitions, near seas, far seas, it almost, with these long-range rocket forces, blurs those lines, which are, the first island chain and beyond. But they have built up the numbers of ships. But navies, as you and I both know, are very expensive. So China's got some economic problems right now. I mean, the economy really needs a 6% return or growth in order to sustain their more than 1.5 billion people in all of these projects they have, both in One Belt, One Road, and also naval construction and white shipping construction and commercial shipping construction. By the way, they have 5,600 Chinese flag commercial ships to our 180. It dwarfs us when we think about the role of commercial maritime and supporting the warfighter. So keeping in mind that they're under some economic pressure, can they continue to afford this naval arms race and to sustain it across the globe? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question as to what their time horizon is. Is there some termination of this massive buildup that's driven either by a plan or by simple economic limitations? We don't know. It's astounding how much they build and how fast they build things. As far as we know, they don't build weapons faster than we do, but they build more than we do. So, where we might produce 1 or 2 DDGs a year, they'll produce 6 to 8 a year. And so, can they sustain that? And what is their understanding of how much is enough? What are they building up towards? And we spent a lot of time thinking about that because Xi Jinping in 2021, of course, tasked the PLA to be ready for war over Taiwan no later than 2027. Yet they continue to make longer-term investments in new platforms and new weapons, which will not come to fruition until the 2030s. So what is their long-term goal? Do they still think that Taiwan is going to be an issue in 2040 or 2050 that has to be solved? I can't imagine that Xi Jinping believes that. He was born in 1953. He's 71 years old. I think that he views himself as the senior leader in China who is destined in order to achieve China's vision of greatness during his tenure, and certainly by 2049, which is the centennial of the creation of the Chinese, the Chinese Communist takeover of China.
Right.
And I think he is probably on a fairly short timeline in order to achieve his goals. So what is their ultimate game? And of course, there is an argument that once you start getting the military-industrial complex going and producing things, ships, missiles, whatever. It will just keep cranking things out forever. What is the ultimate goal here? And do they see themselves as having, and you alluded to this, strategic vulnerabilities for their economy, for imports and exports that are going to have to be addressed and are driving farther and farther out? And I think that's part of it. It's a sea denial, air denial littoral around China to keep U.S. and enemy forces at bay, a denial zone that reaches farther out, but also an ability to provide security for the One Belt, One Road initiative in which they are dependent for their imports and exports coming into and out of China, which drives this increasing extension of their long-range precision strike force to, we expect by the end of the decade, true intercontinental range. But it isn't really clear, once again, what China's end game is and what their timeline is, but it is of extreme concern that their end game is global reach, and their timeline is much sooner than we hope it would be based upon our own transition to the long-range precision strike dominant future that we see coming.
Got it. Thank you very much. A very eloquent explanation there. And I think they have challenges just like we do. I mean, our economy is doing pretty well, but certainly manpower is a challenge for us, both in the industrial base and putting ships to sea. And I know they can conscript as many young people as they want, but they don't have a professional cadre of mariners, and they don't have non-commissioned officers like we do. So good luck with that to the PLA Navy. Jim, you operate the classified level, and you frequently have the opportunity, and you're a master at this. I really admire you. You're able to explain things to people, whether they be members of the Congress, the Hill, staffers, naval officers with clearances, people without clearances. You can explain what's going on in the Western Pacific, and you can kind of raise the level of awareness and kind of get people's interest piqued when you talk about all these numbers and long-range strike and that sort of thing. But as a former intel officer, how do you feel about open source intelligence in this field? I mean, we got the China Maritime Studies Institute. I've followed them for, I don't know, better part of 15 years or so. I think they're very impressive with what they do with open source information. So how should the curators and consumers of intelligence products approach the rich environment that's out there in social media? And how about the vetting process? Over to you.
Yeah, it's amazing what the Chinese do publish and how much information we can glean from open source in China. It is a very oppressive regime which tries to control everything, and yet with 1.5 billion people, there's a tremendous popular interest in military affairs, and an awful lot of information finds its way into the open source. And I would have to, give my kudos to the China Maritime Studies Institute here, with some of the finest Mandarin linguists in the world on military issues, who have this publishing juggernaut, which produces product after product after product, which really give us a deep open source insight as to what's happening in China. I think it's extremely important, and I think we could use more linguists, more who are cognizant of military capabilities, which means you pretty much have to be associated and attached to an organization like the Naval War College to get that grounding, because we deal with these people on a regular basis. We're able to help them make that transition from what we know on the classified side to what they're looking at on the unclassified side. And for those who are interested in getting a deeper understanding of what China is doing, I would certainly point them to the China Maritime Studies Institute and the products they make freely available online. So it's incredibly important. But I'll also say that the intelligence community, I think, has done an excellent job over the past several decades with technical intelligence to help us understand what's going on in China. And it's we need to have a lot more officers in the U.S. military who are focused on this problem and using these sources to try and understand what is happening and come up with solutions to some of these most vexing problems. That's one of our key outputs here at Halsey Alpha, is to try and produce a cadre of future officers who are fully cognizant of these joint warfighting challenges. On the other hand, Halsey Alpha reaches maybe 1% of all Naval War College graduates a year. We can graduate about 25 students a year between Halsey Alpha and Bravo, which does RAND. So we get maybe in Halsey Alpha, maybe 12, 13 students that we graduate a year. It's a very, very small number compared to the entire officer corps. And in my view, if there's one real limitation we have, it's an officer corps which is just not fully up to speed and educated on some of these major challenges that we're facing in the Western Pacific. Careers are just too jam-packed with stuff. And, there's always no time for education at a tactical, technical level. We're going to have to make time for that.
Oh, I'm on board with you. I am fully behind education for sea power. I know the Secretary of the Navy is too, and he spent a lot of time up there. But I've met your students both in-house and your graduates that have headed out in the fleet, and you just do an impressive job. And I guess take solace in the fact that it may only be 12 or 13 students, but it's like seed pod. Then when they get out there, they talk about what they learned, and they train their war dreams, which is really, really important. So perhaps additional officers will want to jump on the bandwagon when they get there. To kind of finish up our conversation here today, I thought I would ask you for your thoughts on a couple of the flashpoints that we're paying attention to right now in the Western Pacific. So here at the Center for Maritime Strategy, we've seen a lot of activity in the Spratlys in the last few months, and particularly with Second Thomas Shoal, which probably a lot of our listeners are not familiar with. So can you tell our listeners today what the situation is there, and why it's important, and what are the United States obligations to our mutual treaty of defense with the Philippines, and how should we approach this very aggressive behavior by Chinese Coast Guard and the PLA Navy in Second Thomas Shoal? Over.
Sure. If there is one flashpoint which is essentially is going to come to some type of resolution sooner rather than later at Second Thomas Shoal. It is an uninhabited shoal in the eastern South China Sea, west of Palawan. It's inside of the so-called 10-dash line, the area which China claims inside of the South China Sea. But it's also within the claimed territorial limits of the Philippines. And back in 1999, in order to make a claim on this shoal, the Philippines grounded an old ex-US LST called the Sierra Madre on this shoal, and it's been sitting there ever since. It's 25 years. It's been sitting on this shoal, occupied by 12 Philippine Marines who subsist by fishing and subsist by periodic resupply by sea and air from the Philippine mainland. It's a decrepit hulk. Every year, more and more pieces fall off of it. It will eventually crumble into the sea, probably sooner rather than later. One major storm that goes through there is just going to destroy the hulk, and those Marines are going to have to be evacuated. This has been a real sticking point for China, this particular situation. The Philippines says when the Sierra Madre crumbles into the sea, they are going to replace it with another LST. And China says that will not be allowed. And for the past several years, China has maintained a pretty solid blockade around this hulk. They have periodically allowed turnover of these Philippine Marines. They periodically allow resupply vessels in, but only to bring necessary food. They always turn back any type of vessel coming from the Philippines with construction equipment to stabilize the hull. And they essentially said, once that hull crumbles, it's over. China will take control of the shoal, and the Philippines will not be allowed back in. They often take the Philippines to the brink, and they appear to be doing that right now. And an inordinate number of vessels are around the Sierra Madre right now. And they have been preventing, I think, over the past few weeks, even resupply of food. And the question is, do they simply try and starve the Marines out? I don't think so. I think they take them right to the edge and then they allow resupply in, just to demonstrate what could happen if the Philippines are not compliant in what China wants. But once again, when it crumbles into the ocean, a decision is going to have to be made. I presume the Chinese will immediately go and pick up the Marines and repatriate them. Now, as far as the U.S. obligation, up until I think 2016, the U.S. was adamant that the U.S.-Philippine Treaty did not cover the South China Sea. It only covered the metropolitan Philippines. But in 2016, I believe that was the year, the U.S. government, under the urging of the Philippines, said, we will consider the U.S.-Philippine Defense Treaty to cover Philippine forces anywhere on Earth, which means since that time, the Philippine Marines on the Sierra Madre are covered under our treaty obligation if the Philippines comes to us and requests assistance, which to date they have not done. So this is a true flashpoint. Something's going to happen. That Sierra Madre will not last forever, and decisions are going to have to be made. I will defer the issue of what we should do because this is a red line for China, and they've said it's a red line. And I think it's up to the senior decision makers in the U.S. who are far more attuned to Chinese thinking than I am to decide whether or not we get involved. And this is the one where we draw the line, and this is the one that starts the conflict. So I'll leave that to others.
Absolute flashpoint. I agree with you. And time is running out. Let's move on to the next one. The Senkaku Islands, depending on whether you're Japanese Senkaku or Chinese Diaoyu, is another of China's maritime disputes with a U.S. ally, Japan. So how does Beijing view these islands, and what's the dispute with Tokyo all about? And what are the U.S. security obligations to Japan? We also have a mutual treaty of defense with Japan since the end of the Second World War. Over to you.
Sure. The Senkakus are in the East China Sea, so now we're moving north of Taiwan, in a disputed zone between China and Japan. Japan's view is the East China Sea should be divided between China and Japan based on the center line going down the sea. China says no, their territorial limits should extend to the edge of the continental shelf, which hugs up against the Ryukyu Islands. So the disputed area is a big wedge in the middle of the East China Sea, in which both sides claim control and claim undisputed resource exploitation rights, which has been an issue since both sides have put platforms in there and disputed the presence of the other side. The Senkakus are unoccupied. I suppose they could be occupied, but they're kind of big rock outcroppings. And this has become I guess, the focus of attention. The view is whoever controls the Senkakus will and get the other side to agree to that, will then be able to control this disputed area. They were nominally controlled by Japan, although China always claimed them. After World War II, the United States took control and used them as a bombing range. And then when the United States pulled out of Okinawa, the United States unilaterally gave administrative control back to Japan, much to the consternation of China, who said, well, we have a claim to these islands. So Japan has administered control, or asserted administration of control, but never occupied them. The United States position, by the way, in the East China Sea and South China Sea is the same. We take no position officially on ownership of any of these features. We do recognize administration and occupation, and we do oppose any change in administration and occupation using coercion or military force. So our view is China is the legitimate administrator of those islands, but China has not and probably never will occupy them. China has maintained a significant naval presence around those islands for years now, and so has Japan. Japan has always had one or two combatants out there. Both sides will fly aircraft around them. Neither side has occupied them, but both sides say they will take appropriate action should the opponent occupy those islands. I don't think either side is going to do it. I don't think either side wants that as a flashpoint. However, the United States has always been adamant that Japanese forces come under the U.S.-Japan Treaty, and because we recognize the administration of those islands by Japan As far as I know, the occupation of those islands, control of those islands would come under the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty. But I don't think Japan will set foot on those islands, and I don't think in the current climate China will either.
Wow, very interesting. And common denominator between the two, second Thomas Shoal, and I think the Senkakus, is the discovery of oil near both places, which has everybody's interest piqued. So the last situation, and the big one, is Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Less than 3 years away from my friend Admiral Phil Davidson's Davidson window, when Beijing aims to be ready to either take Taiwan by force if it so chooses, or assimilate it through other means. What do you think? Do you think it'll be a military move by the end of the decade? After 2027, have they studied Ukraine and decided to make some changes in their force posture? Or would this look more like kind of a gray zone operation and a quote unquote peaceful assimilation? And what are the ramifications for the United States and our allies?
Yeah, I think China is serious about Taiwan. They call it not only the core interest, they call it the core of the core interest. I mean, they're telling us it's
double core. Yeah.
And I think what they have convinced themselves is that is the first domino that would fall if China is going to follow the path of the Soviet Union with pieces spinning off. If they let Taiwan go, all of a sudden Tibet goes, Xinjiang goes, the mayor of Shanghai says, I think I'm independent. Everything just splits apart. It seems unlikely that anything like that would happen. But I think the Chinese leadership has convinced themselves of this. And I think they're serious when they say this is an existential issue, and that incorporation politically of Taiwan under China is a matter not if, but when. And I think I'm convinced that Xi Jinping believes that he cannot turn over power in China without having resolved these major issues in China's littorals, and Taiwan is first among them. Now, he did say that the PLA, and he did task the PLA to be ready to take military action in Taiwan not later than 2027, but no one has ever said that there is actually a timeline. No one has ever said this is the day we're going to go. They have continued to develop their amphibious force. The most recent interesting issue is this conversion of commercial roll-on, roll-off vessels to military utility, which has occurred over the past several years, which means they're trying to greatly expand their lift capacity to Taiwan. I think they've easily doubled it in the past 2 to 3 years with these ro-ros. And one question is, if they keep converting these ro-ros, what size force can they lift to Taiwan in the future? We've looked at, like everyone, has a broad range of possible Chinese approaches to taking Taiwan, from close blockade, distant blockade, a missile blockade, some type of the kind of pressurization campaign using Chinese maritime militia, Coast Guard that continues to compress the island. We've looked at a coup de main, toppling of the government, and a seizure of the government. Most interesting, of course, is our conclusion. At the end of the day, China has to actually occupy Taiwan with boots. It's not enough just to continue to pummel them with missiles. They have to get troops onto Taiwan. They have to raise the flag and say, we own the island. And so we've been most interested in various amphibious approaches. I think you have two possibilities. One is a multi-day or multi-week, multi-echelon approach where modest forces are continued to be sent into Taiwan to reinforce a lodgment, eventually a breakout, you take over the island. The other one, which we've looked at in the last couple of years, is a D-Day invasion. China builds up enough lift that they could actually carry 120 to 150,000 troops in one lift to multiple locations and try and seize the entire island at once. None of these options are without risk. None of these options will lead to enough of an assured resolution of the conflict that at least our red teams would be willing to pull the trigger on any of them. And I think China has probably gone through the same type of analysis. There's not any one of these approaches, not one of them looks really good. Either it's a total failure, and then you're resorting to, if it's a strategic issue, I'm having to go nuclear, which they don't want to do, or I get a lodgment on Taiwan, let's say, or I'm opposing a prolonged bombardment or blockade of Taiwan, which begins to look like an endless Russia-Ukraine war, in which China loses the strategic initiative, and without controlling that, there's no evident resolution, which does not lead to unwanted escalation. I honestly think it's a real dilemma for Xi Jinping and the PLA, because there's no slam dunk approach which is going to give them Taiwan in the near term. And we're looking at this very, very carefully, but very much alarmed by the continued buildup of China's missile force. And I think the fallback option would be a major missile blockade, missile bombardment campaign to try and reduce Taiwan's defenses to the extent that they are open to a minimally opposed occupation, while they're also using their missiles to push U.S. power projection way back in the Pacific. Very messy. I think condemnation would come down on their heads. But again, from China's perspective, world condemnation came down on China in 1989 over Tiananmen. 20 years later, they're hosting the Olympics. And so I think they'll do what they have to do. But this is very dangerous with a very high prospect for escalation that we have to be very careful about.
Well, ending on that note, we got to be on guard here. And I am happy that we're currently running the Pacific Rim exercise as a show of great force and forward presence, and also the strength of our alliances with many different countries out in the Asia Pacific. And that's something that China is unable to boast about. They don't have as many friends as the United States. And the more heinous their actions, the more potential friends they lose. So, Jim, thanks very much. That's a wrap for Maritime Nation today. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to express my deep appreciation to Professor Jim Fitzsimonds, not just for doing the podcast today, but for all the work and the decades of education and training for naval officers in the Halsey Alpha group, and for clarifying some of these threats that are out there on the horizon for Americans like you and me. I'd also like to thank our sound engineer, the Venerable James Peterson, for another successful podcast recording, and thank our listeners for joining us each month. If you haven't heard previous episodes, you can always catch up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here can be found on our website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org. Thanks for Data Miner for the sponsorship and the support. And ladies and gents, stay tuned for the next episode of Maritime Nation. Have a great week.